Hello, everyone. By now, you would have reached the middle of our Saving Dignity Week, and today is a very special day for us because we're providing the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes podcast from the Regional Office on the Middle East and North Africa. Today, we have with us our regional representative, Ms. Cristina Albertin, who's going to be talking with us about the topic of trafficking in conflict settings. And thank you so much, Cristina, for being with us. Can you please tell us what is trafficking in persons and how do conflict situations influence its dynamics and occurrence?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nermin, for inviting me to this podcast during this very important week. Yeah, definitely the issue of trafficking in persons can be very closely related also to conflict settings. As we all know, trafficking in persons is a very serious crime through which a person is recruited, harbored, transported using the means of force, abduction, coercion, abuse, deception for the purpose of exploitation. And these forms of exploitation can be multiple. It could be sexual exploitation, forced labor, organ trafficking, illegal adoption, forced marriage, and others. Trafficking in persons happens all over the world, and most of its victims are women and girls. And that means 3/4 of all victims are women and girls. When it comes to sexual exploitation, the number is even higher. It is 94% of the victims of sexual exploitation who are women and girls. And when we look at conflict settings, we find that this is one of the most prominent forms of trafficking, the sexual exploitation of women and girls by members of armed and terrorist groups. But of course, we also find the form of use of trafficked children as soldiers, organ trafficking for wounded finders, and enslavement as a tactic of terrorism and in connection with other crimes, for example, genocide or war crimes. When we look at the MENA region, I think we all remember the heart-wrenching stories by survivors of enslavement by ISIL, especially of the Yazidi women and girls. The same can be said for other groups. For example, the terrorist group Boko Haram in Nigeria that has also enslaved hundreds of women. In Africa, we had a lot of conflict settings where children have been used as child soldiers. In this regard, it's important to notice when it comes to conflict, human trafficking can very often intersect with other crimes. As I said, sexual violence, sexual enslavement, atrocity crimes, terrorism, the funding of terrorism. For example, it is known that ISIL also got funding flows from the enslavement of women. But it also intersects with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and it can intersect with grave violations against children. And this is why it is so important to properly assess and understand the situation so that human trafficking victims and survivors can be identified and assisted, and also perpetrators can be brought to justice.
It really seems like it's a very complex situation that victims go through. Do you think that COVID-19 has made any impact or effect on trafficking in conflict?
Well, I would not say that it has made a specific impact, but if we look at conflict situations, I mean, countries and communities, they are already caught up in armed conflict and already face a lot of challenges because of the outbreak and the root causes of the conflict. And these include like the collapse, the weakening of state institutions. Police is not there, health institutions have collapsed, schools do not work anymore. There is no rule of law or a weakened rule of law, and impunity reigns completely. And then the socio-economic stress because the economy goes down, jobs are being lost, the social fabric is being fragmented, families break down because of conflict, and it comes to large-scale forced displacement. So, I mean, this is already a situation in conflict. So if we see that a pandemic comes, such as COVID, both the exposure and the vulnerability to trafficking in persons will, of course, increase because jobs have been lost, movements have been restricted, and vulnerable groups become more dependent on others. And these are the opportunities that perpetrators prey on. They look mercilessly for profit, abusing people as commodity in highly vulnerable situations.
Based on that, what do you think is the recommended approach to prevent trafficking in persons in conflict, and how is UNODC supporting this?
When we look at preventing trafficking in persons in conflict and how UNODC is supporting this, let's remember that in 2010, the world community adopted the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its specific protocol on trafficking in persons. This protocol sets out clearly what needs to be done to counter human trafficking effectively. We need a comprehensive approach, combining penalization, prosecution, protection, and prevention. Also, multi-stakeholder and partnership approaches are key for effectively countering human trafficking. We already have 178 states that are party to this protocol, and that confirms the broad understanding worldwide of human trafficking in conflict, but also the commitment of governments to end human trafficking. So since the entry into force of this TIP protocol, UNODC has been working with many stakeholders and partners to end human trafficking also in conflict. Our main priority has been to provide specialized expertise in enhancing the criminal justice response to human trafficking through training and capacity building for law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and judges. And this, of course, also applies to post-conflict settings. Although it will be much more difficult because of the reduced capacities during a conflict. But still, all these officials, they need to understand the concept of human trafficking as a serious organized crime, and they need to ensure that perpetrators can be brought to justice. And this will also require that criminal justice officials use latest methodologies, technologies, like how to address cybercrime issues, how to do criminal analysis, how to conduct forensics, and there are specific approaches to human trafficking. Not to forget, they always have to be victim-centered and human rights-based. And our work should also include the work with social and health workers as well as labor officials, because they can even be the frontline officers who first meet a human trafficking victim. A human trafficking victim is a hidden population. It is not easy to see and to identify a human trafficking victim. But there might be a chance when a human trafficking victim approaches a health station, a health post, or some other education, a school, that there is an official who can help identify and refer the person. It is also important with regard to border management, because when people flee conflict, they often have to cross borders. And also border officials need to know how to identify victims and refer them to respective protection mechanisms. Let me just mention something that I have that I forgot to mention before, especially with regard to the importance of border officials. The MENA region is a region that hosts a huge refugee and internally displaced population. Actually, the last policy brief of the UNSG on the impact of COVID on the Arab region, he mentions that the Arab region has 55 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. And of these, 26 million are refugees or internally displaced population. All these people are vulnerable, and all these people will be in contact with officials when they are on the move. So this is why it is so important to work with the officials. As UNODC, we work with the Department of Peacekeeping Operations to develop training modules on trafficking in persons, so that also these officials that are being deployed to peacekeeping or political or peace building missions, that they also understand how to identify victims. In general, UNODC works with a lot of UN sister agencies, including IOM, the Population Fund, UNHCR, ILO, UN Women, and UNICEF. and we all contribute our specific expertise, and we join hands in common advocacy and communication to end human trafficking and impunity to it. We just now start to develop interventions to address human trafficking in refugee settings in the Middle East, which is a long overdue task given the size of the population. Finally, let me mention that I mentioned the case of the Yazidis and Nadia Murad. UNODC is really extremely honored that Nadia Murad, after her brave escape of the ISIL captivity in Iraq, that she has accepted the honor to serve as the UNODC Goodwill Ambassador for the dignity of survivors of human trafficking. As we know, Nadia is from the region and she understands the complexity. She has lived through it. She carries the voice of so many survivors, the voice for the need to deliver justice to the victims and survivors, to end impunity, and to support survivors to be able to heal, return to a life, and find happiness again. Talking about survivors, let me also mention that UNODC is administering a fund that the United Nations has set up, the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund for victims of trafficking in persons, especially women and children. This fund has been established in recognition that NGOs can play a fundamental and critical role to provide assistance and support to human trafficking victims and survivors. And that can be different services, like essential humanitarian, legal, and financial aid to victims, or access to services and remedies. It is very often that it is the local NGO that can best provide such services because they know the local context and they know the local community. And it is important to strengthen the local response, also in conflict settings. So this is one form more that everybody can contribute to, and UNODC is happy to administer this fund.
Thank you, Cristina, for this very important point. And speaking of the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund and UNODC's work, how can the international community include protection of and assistance to victims of trafficking in persons in its response to conflict settings?
Well, in general, as I said before, the convention and the Trafficking in Persons Protocol is a convention that entered into force in 2003, and all state parties, 178 so far, they have the commitment to implement the respective provisions, including on protection of victims. And that also includes conflict and post-conflict settings. Conflict settings are not a permit to work on international obligations. But of course, it is clear that it will be much more difficult to implement them, in particular in areas where state authorities are undermined or reduced and priorities are put in different areas. I think the international community always must play an important role in pinpointing to the need to be vigilant to human trafficking and to support the efforts that help prosecute, protect, and prevent human trafficking in line with the provisions of the TIP protocol. And I also think that there are a lot of opportunities for that. I mean, I have mentioned before that knowledge of and understanding of human trafficking is key. It needs to be understood and addressed properly. It should not be confused with anything else. Depending, of course, on the context, it might be possible to work with communities through their organizations and with NGOs to raise awareness and reach out to possible victims. It is important to foster the understanding for the plight of human trafficking victims. I mean, we have seen cases where women have been rescued and they wanted to return to the communities. But especially victims of sexual enslavement who might come back with children that were born out of rape or the sexual enslavement, they are not always welcome back to their communities, and they will face stigma or even blame. They might be blamed for what they have been done. Sometimes they will be even accused of crimes. They will be seen as criminals. In some countries, they will be seen as sex workers, especially in countries where sex work is not legal. So this is a very important situation that we have to address. We have to see the human trafficking victim as a victim, and no victim should be criminalized for a crime that was committed while being trafficked. This is a very important provision of the TIP protocol also. So this is why the international community and we all have a role to play in creating this understanding and to provide concrete support. And this might also entail that we have to protect the human trafficking victim who faces persecution by the traffickers, and we might be called upon to grant international protection or refugee status to this person. And this actually has happened. Some countries have granted this status to human trafficking victims. I also think that when, as international community, when we engage with humanitarian assistance providers, also they have to be sensitized on human trafficking, how to identify them and how to provide the right assistance and support. Human trafficking victims will have a lot of needs that go beyond the usual humanitarian assistance, and these need to be addressed. One very critical one is the protection from the trafficker and the delivery of the justice to the system. And then, of course, the same is true for implementing partners, that they are also aware of existence and risk of human trafficking and the need to take action against it. As I mentioned before, in peacekeeping, peace building and political missions, it would be important that we have regular and standard pre-deployment training of peacekeepers and other personnel on human trafficking. Mission assignments can include gender-sensitive data collection and research on human trafficking before the mission starts and while the mission continues. Technical assistance measures should always include capacity building and training for security and criminal justice officials. And at national level, also for health, social, and education workers. So, I mean, I think if we are all aware, if we are more sensitized, and if we can integrate these sensitization and training measures in our own missions and in our work with the national duty bearers, then I think we have made a big progress. I'm very much aware of the delivery of justice is a major challenge in ongoing conflicts, and very often we look only at justice once the conflict is settled through transitional justice measures or long-term justice, re-establishment. But in no way the delivery of justice to human trafficking victims can be forgotten or neglected when conflicts have been settled or peace agreement signed. I mean, I just would like to say, I mean, human trafficking has been recognized through the adoption of the TIP protocol as a serious crime, which is often an organized one. And we need everybody to be engaged and involved to counter it, and also to end conflict. To end it also in conflict settings, delivering justice to the victims and survivors, and end the impunity.
Well, thank you so much, Cristina. It really was a wealth of information, and it's very important for us to also hear from the listeners. So if anyone who's listening has a comment or a suggestion or an experience that you would like to share, just tag us on social media through the usernames in the description or use the hashtag Saving Dignity, and let's all work together to raise awareness and to end human trafficking. Thank you so much for listening.